you both very much. Any questions from the audience here? We have already one from the chat.
Chris Twin. Does the change in Part L address the loophole that was in the previous version, which is internal heat gains in offices, an unregulated heat gain being used to deal with the regulated heat loss? In other words, BCO internal heat gains go into the notional building, they then transfer over into your model, your actual building, and you're dealing with most of your heat losses using the computer gains or the small power gains. Arguably the reason why we've still got an awful lot of new all glass buildings going up. Is that addressed in any way in the new Part L?
So I don't think it is, at least as yet, but I understand current that apparently there is a task force that's dealing with ESPA general and how this is going to be updated in the future. And part of this actually looking to internal gains. So at the moment we're using the NCM term condition 5.276.4, whatever it is, the latest one. I think it says actually under consultation now how this is going to change in the future. But it's a good point because at the moment we're seeing that when we're doing operational energy models, that the heating is always underestimated when you're doing an operational energy model compared to a bargel model. So I think this is something that has to be addressed. Hopefully it's going to be addressed soon. I don't know if you want to add any other questions from here? So this one question is thinking about to respond. So when you were suggesting that you don't plan down the operational targets and specify the same. Since the question was if we're using our clients for this, now to use energy.
You can use either, so you can use 1654, or if you're doing DFB on the design job, you can use that. They'll give you different numbers though, because they're different methodologies. So it depends on what you do. If you're already doing DFB on the job, you're unlikely to go for the 1654 calculation anyway. So it really just depends. But yeah, of course, they'll give you different numbers because they use different methodologies.
I think at the moment still DLA hasn't been explicit about it, but you have to use your full operational.
And again, this is a reporting technique tool that they want us to start using, but you can use that. They don't have any restrictions on what you can.
Any other questions, John?
Sorry, a different one. Your comment about retrofit was interesting. Improve the fabric, you increase the embodied carbon. It's interesting the things coming out of TM 65 and 65.1. The idea that we improve our fabric and therefore reduce the embodied carbon because you're putting less kit in, but the fact that refrigerants may ellipse all of this. Therefore, if you get the wrong refrigerant, and some of those systems have got the wrong refrigerant, or they've got vast amounts of it because there's pipes laced throughout the building with refrigerant, that might be bigger than the embodied whole life carbon of the rest of your systems in their entirety. Is that not so?
Design systems because different kinds of moment during. I think part of adapting all the new standards and more numbers would have more reporting to an actual operation energy, the more I think it's going to get more transparent of what exactly we do.
It's interesting though that trying to work out what the leakage might be or measuring it, monitoring it, but it's then interesting to see some of the suppliers beginning to come up with hybrid systems to limit the extent of the refrigerant and distribute more by water to get the final emitters, which is interesting. Yeah, centralized, that helps, definitely.
This is a common actually question. They're suggesting that for high energy use buildings such as process users, high pharma heavy industry, so on, part that now is applicable where this before wasn't. So that's a good point to be hard on. What I found actually very interesting was preparing the presentation with Monica Baran was that this GLA balance where we actually always had to achieve 10% and 50% benefits in for commercial building, then something in the notional building has been graded considerably, but these targets haven't moved, so the whole goalpost now has moved a long way. And all of the systems, all of the design, all the buildings have to improve massively quite soon. I don't know if the industry is ready for it yet, which is quite fun, but again, I found very interesting the response from GLA suggesting that we know it's achievable yet, we'll have to find a way. I think it's a balance.
Yeah, I think their idea is that as we continue to decarbonise as well, it's going to get easier.
You mind just moving along, goes to the microphone. Yeah,
I think the idea is that as we decarbonise the grid and technology improves, which is exactly the response, is going to get easier and easier to achieve those targets. And that's why we think we're going to get these schemes that are not achieving these targets, but they're going to go ahead regardless. So we'll have to see. It is perhaps that they will reverse on the decision and they decide that actually it's going way too slow and we're going to have to lower the targets because the expectation was that they were going to lower the targets basically, rather than keeping them the same as they were.
Challenging, but let's how it
Krisha here, work here. The future home standards looks like a very high percentage in terms of.
So if you don't mind, just everybody speak up a bit so we can actually hear us on.
Yeah. Okay. So the future home standard, very high percentage in terms of difference against the 2013, I think. So will future home standard supersede the parcel? And then the second question is the 80% technically feasible, considering what we know already and what's technologically feasible?
Yes, it will supersede it, and that's why we on the street the parcel 2021 as an interim standard before the future building standards introduced. And good question and point on the 80% because that does seem like an immense challenge. And even just looking at the case studies that about the 90s, when we really struggled to get some of this improvement. So it's a good question, and I'm not sure that we know the answer to it just yet. I think quite a lot of it is going to come out from the consultation pack and the feedback that the industry gives to them as well as to we've experienced about 2021. This is really unachievable. You're not considering X, Y, and Z at the same time, and I think we'll know a little bit more next year.
And also in this point, like one fit for all approach doesn't work, as I mentioned in the efficiency ratios of the plants. So if you use a generic one for any different sort of buildings, it will be failing at that point. But if you go for a detailed analysis for the buildings and understanding the what building is expecting from you, then you can able to focus on the required points of the building, because it's not about spending tons of money and make the best building at all. It's about understanding building and doing what it needs to be.
I think it's a good point because now we're focusing on mostly on offices, but if you start looking warehouses and other types of units, it's completely different places. It's completely different places. Silky?
Just wanted to mention controls. You touched on that, but I think it's going to controls and energy management is also an important thing to get an uplift when we're talking about really high performing building. But it's not very specific how they're going to be assessed because now it's not part of the notional building, right? So there's no way of actually assessing it and giving you a percentage, if I'm right.
So there is a definition for the controls, like how you can apply it for what you should be considering as a minimum. But as this is again only regulatory, so it's not covering the whole thing, and it's not like going beyond the construction. So all those changes would be more applicable or just can be a game changer in the operation itself.
There is another one, the chat. I'm gonna actually read it, but I think it's opening a big can of worms. But anyway, and if we see a green hydrogen being more green than full electric and having less CO2 emissions, which I think is the question of the industry. I don't think this. So I don't think this probably panel can fix that. There is, I think, a very good publication from Letty that can do that. But I don't know if anybody can. I'm definitely going to stay away from one of that question because I don't think I can. I don't have the background and knowledge.
I was going to say that the future energy scenario that came out of the National Grid is talking a lot about hydrogen and how much role it's going to play in the future energy system. So yeah, I think it's a good start.
There was some read an article the other day talking about, you know, hydrogen within housing. Essentially, it's going to cost twice to install compared to gas boilers and things like that. So it's going to be tricky. I'm not going to say I'm not an expert. So I'm going to deflect this question. Go
on. Two aspects. One, to go back to your point about GLA. GLA are asking for 50% better for residential.
Yes.
So it's a bigger jump, but then we were delivering 80% better than Part L beforehand. And one of the key elements.
It depends on the systems we use.
Yeah, but one of the key things was reducing distribution losses. And it's very interesting that government seem to have got themselves into a pickle. The district heating carbon factors are a bloody great relaxation compared with using electric and heat pump in your buildings, because they've been sold by our industry. District heating is a way forward, but the standing losses are so much higher. But park that from now. The hydrogen, and I must declare an interest. I led the team in Letty looking at hydrogen. I just invite you to find any. And therefore, how the hell can you design for it if there isn't any? And the idea of regionally switching over almost overnight to hydrogen, even if the pipes will take it, how do you convert all of those buildings almost instantaneously? And it's very interesting to dig through things like Hansard, so that's MPs complaining about the switch over to North Sea gas. They didn't have social media at the time, and the idea of having no gas for 6 months and therefore no heating, politicians will be absolutely crucified now. So, and it only needs a few examples of those, but I'll park that for now. I've declared my special interest.
I think it's a good point about, you know, residential. It's not part of our discussion today, but I had experience like maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, designing a big scheme in London where we're trying to push for an ambient loop system to increase, you know, the losses and everything around it. But then the council was actually pushing back because they wanted to know what some types of boilers there. And we're trying to prove to them, you know, one, savings of around 30%, the others around 80%. It's a good system. We're even talking about, you know, case studies, going to seeing, you know, live projects, and it's always very, very, you know, strong about no, we don't trust it. But then I've actually, you know, I've gone away from planning for the last year, so a bit more on existing buildings, starting buildings, but start seeing some small like cases or small projects popping with ambient loop systems. So I think it's all of us in an industry pushing the boundaries as much as we can, you know, knocking the door all the time. And at some point they will start saying yes, because they will see it's better. So it's not easy, but I think we have to strive for the best. Yes. Any other questions or comments?
I've picked I've watched the IES webinar about the Part L. So with the change in carbon factors, PV is not going to be a driver anymore. Do we think that the industry would still have a chance for the buildings where domestic hot water demand is a driver, to use the solar thermal? And do you guys see that on your projects? Would you promote using solar thermal in England?
I can take this as well. But essentially, the last 2 years, been working mostly on standing assets, and I've seen a lot of projects with solar thermal being disconnected, being completely disconnected for the whole duration of the building being live because they're complicated, because they don't work, and then being removed and PV panels being installed, especially for commercial buildings, not residential, for commercial. So it's something to consider. You know, sometimes we over-design buildings. We think like best solution, but it's not always the best solution because it's the more efficient one. We have to think about how people are using them, because you know you have buildings and you have people. Those daily people in buildings pressing all these buttons and start destroying how the the building's supposed to be working. So I think we have to consider in operation as well at the same time. I think so. Any further comments?
Yeah, I agree. I don't have as much probably experience of solar thermal as I do with PVs, which I mean from a body type perspective, not really a go-to, but there's always a pushback from the councils because they really want it's a green sticker. It looks good. We are green. We are renewable. It's true though, and they are great, but they do have the lifetime as well. They do need to be replaced.
But again, if you speak about it, again, it's the thing. It's the type of building. You think for an office building, high-rise building, the big of solar thermal job, is it the right answer? Possibly not. If you're thinking about a warehouse, where the floor ratio to the height is not that great, yes, PV panels are actually, we're seeing them being fully covered. I mean, all buildings are starting.
So, like for the solar thermal, for instance, for a building type, when you have only the domestic hot water demand, like early in the morning, and you can, like the only time you can generate that hot water would be during the day. So the only option, you need to store that heated water to the morning and use it if you don't lose all the energy. And it will just have additional storage. It will have additional insulation on that to cover that. And it would be additional embodied carbon to the system. So like if I go back to my point, so every building needs to be treated individually, and it doesn't matter if it is thermal solar or PV panel or any other systems. If it fits the profiles, the demand of the building, it can be used, comparing both operational and the embodied carbons together. So it's the only way forward. That's how I see it.
I think it's a good point. We have to start adopting the way of thinking. In the past, just installing PV panels itself. Sometimes now it's better to install them east or west than about residential, because this is where actually the demand is, or used to be before COVID anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a good point. I think it's still designing on on compliance, but now we have to move towards the real world. For
me, it's also the example when the industry is not driven. So for the PV market, which is prospering, the technology is moving forward, but I think with the market of solar thermal, it's just stagnated.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't move somewhere. It didn't improve as such, which I think there's still
I think it's
a
demand
space
as
to do.
well. I mean, I'm from Greece. So if you go back to Greece, every single house has solar. Every single house, but many houses in Greece have solar thermal because it makes sense. Whenever I go back there, never there no hot water because I always have free water because of the solar thermal. Same thing, and every single town is because you have more houses, more footprint. Not if you go to a building in London, Hackney, or whatever, where it's 15 stories tall, just putting there 10 solar thermal house only.
Just to watch the floor.
And then also, you go talking about 15 stories, so all these pipes would go up, all the losses should run. Not possible the best solution.
I was going to make an observation about moving from carbon to primary energy on the basis, as you've said, with a grid decarbonising, carbon makes absolutely no sense. Carbon's dealt with upstream by the energy supply, and we are just trying to reduce the amount of energy, and therefore the idea of primary energy makes sense. But it's interesting to hear the discussions beginning to be talked about in the future home standard and and the future building standard about actually the future issue is peak demand, because the grid will not be able to cope with very large winter heat demands as the gas grid can, because our renewables, and even if there's nuclear in there, it's all base load stuff and fairly constant through the year, a little more wind at one time and little more solar at the other. That then means you might well see a move to watts per square meter peak demand, which then starts to drive batteries and other things to smooth out. But it's interesting to look at, for example, California, which has been doing this for a long time, where they penalize any energy used over certain periods. So there's an extra factor you apply, for example. But it's interesting to see this progression away from carbon to energy, and then how we protect the integrity of a zero carbon grid in future.
They also promote smart grids to make it happen. Like in the recent versions of the LEED certification, is one of the most popular credits in like California and other states as well. So yeah, I think it needs to be a part of the discussion.
The idea that in Germany a lot of the heat pumps come with a smart grid label. Interesting, they use English for it, which allows the grid to send you a signal, which effectively means, it may not be quite this, that you have to turn your heat pump off for a certain number of hours. Therefore, trying to design your building so you can coast through the peak periods just gives us a little bit of an idea of what's around the corner.
Actually, funnily enough, the London plan, the previous version, the London plan that did run past, it was issued back in 2020. We had a section talking about big energy demand and how you plan the building to adapt to these standards. I don't think it's really good. More than thing everybody's doing. Just a section about in the future will do this, but it's really coming in the future.
Yeah,
because I don't think it's that known yet. It's not feasible. I think.
Well, it's interesting to see the west of London being told they can't build any homes because the grid doesn't have the capacity, or rather, the server farms got in first.
Other questions to be chat.
I was thinking to open another can of worms, which is CHP. Or how industry is gonna deal with existing CHPs, I would say.
I think it depends, really depends. If you have a CHP, first of all, it's connected, because most of the time it's just install it and then don't connect. Just take the advantage for the compliance modeling. Fine, that's good. First of all, it's that. But how they're gonna be replaced, how soon they're gonna be replaced, and because talking about embodied carbon, but they're being efficient at the same time. So, and again, is the country, because I'm looking for some assets in Netherlands, and gas is going to be cleaner compared to electricity up to 2050. So if you actually have a CHP, it's better compared to a heat pump.
It's all right. We'll provide them with hydrogen.
It's different everywhere.
Chicken and egg.
Yeah. So maybe in Netherlands, the next best thing is really CHP.
Just transfer the knowledge from here to there.
Exactly.
And they did it for the heat pumps from there to here.
Yeah, exactly. But honestly, I don't know how the industry is going to react to CHP, because there are loads of them installed. I think probably still be installed, especially if you're looking outside of Porto. You have schemes that are still going for gas boilers, for CHPs, and why are they doing? When they're trying to implement something different, then they're saying no.
Still, they're still in the last agony. Suppliers of gas and providers.
I don't ever have any CHP suppliers calls, but okay. I think that's probably the end of the presentation. Thank you very much both for presenting and hosting. Everybody said it's an excellent presentation, so well done. We still have some drinks if you want to stay.